Fission radio show with your host, Lonnie Clark. We stand together and accept that we now live in a world transformed by Fukushima. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on UCY.TV radio. We relentlessly engage every ear that listens. We expose and confront the complete lack of accountability for the nuclear industry. Consider social engineering programs who view our bodies, minds, and souls as assets on a balance sheet. We discuss vital current issues, interview activists, and engage our audience in an effort to allow all voices to be heard. The Age of Fission radio show creates a venue that all will choose. We encourage our listeners to reclaim their power and their courage to take action and save our planet from the ravages of greed and indifference. Our actions matter. Every voice matters. We remind our listeners that happiness is resistance. Love is greater than fear. Good morning, UCY.TV radio listeners. This is Lonnie Clark with the Age of Fission radio show. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, KEPW.org, for carrying our show, and Levy Hill Levy Show Nuclear Hot Seat. We really appreciate everybody tuning in. Today, I'm super excited. I'm doing a pre-recorded interview with Dr. Chris Busby, and we don't have much time, so I'm just going to get to it. Thank you, Dr. Busby, for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Okay.
Well, why don't you update? It's been about a year since you've been here. Why don't you update our listeners on the activities that you've been doing? Because I know you've been very active on a lot of different venues. So which would you like to speak to first?
Well, I think the most important one of these now immediately is a new paper which is coming out next week in a journal called Pediatric Dimensions. And this paper deals with the increased risk of childhood leukemia near high voltage power lines. Now, this is an issue that was raised long ago when some people in America, two researchers in America, found that there was an increased risk of childhood leukemia in people who were living within 600 meters of a high voltage power line. And as a result of this paper, lots and lots of studies were done. And in England, they even set up a committee called SAGE to consider the issue. And I was originally appointed on SAGE, but then they threw me off before they had their first meeting. They deselected me. But anyway, as a result of these concerns, what happened was the Childhood Cancer Research Group in England got a lot of money from the government to do a case control epidemiological study of childhood leukemia near power lines in England and Wales. And they did that and published it in 2005. And what they found was that the American studies were correct and that there was an excess risk of childhood leukemia in children who lived close to power lines, but of course, but actually nobody could explain how it worked. And there were lots and lots of theories about how electromagnetic fields could cause childhood leukemia. And indeed, I think the World Health Organization is even now saying that there is this possibility that electromagnetic fields can cause childhood leukemia. So it sort of was accepted that that was the case in 2005. But anyway, more recently, in 2014, an extended study was done by the same people, by the Childhood Cancer Research Group, a woman called Catherine Bunch, and they increased the number of children. Originally there were 9,700 children and 9,700 controls, so 9,700 leukemia children and 9,700 controls. And in this one they increased it to about 16,000 children and about the same number of controls by increasing the time period. The original time period was from 1962 to 1995, and the more recent study did to 2008. So it had a longer time period, and it had more children because it brought in children from Scotland. Anyway, what they found is that over that period, the risk of childhood leukemia, although it did exist at the time of the first study, had disappeared. So in other words, they said that although there was an excess risk in the period 1962 to 95, by the time it got 95 to 2008, in fact, it had decreased. So it was less likely to get childhood leukemia if you lived near a power line. So they said, therefore, there's no way in which a physical effect from a power line could change over that period of time. So it can't have been a real effect. It must have been an artifact. Okay. So what I did was I got the data from both of the studies and I split it up into 10-year time periods. So I looked at 1962 to 69, 1970 to 79, 1980 to 89, 90 to 99, 2000 to 2008. So I looked at these different periods separately. And what I found was that the risk in the first period, 1962 to 69, was very high. It was 4.6-fold, so it was really quite big, and it was statistically significant. Then, in the next period, 70 to 79, it fell down, and then 79 to 80 it fell down again, 89 it fell down again, and 2000 to 2008 it fell down again. So what you've got here is you've got a sharply decreasing risk over that period. Now, since people have suggested that childhood leukemia is associated with radiation, the question is, what sort of radiation exposure could they have had? Right. Could there be that fell in that same trend? And of course, the answer is perfectly obvious. It's the atmospheric weapons test fallout. So what I did then, I got the atmospheric weapons test fallout data, and I plotted it against the excess relative risk of childhood leukemia. And of course, I got a very highly significant correlation. And you know. So in other words, the weapons test fallout is causing the childhood leukemia. How is it doing that? Well, in 1999, a physicist from University of Bristol called Dennis Henshaw, his group showed that what power lines do is, because they have these very high voltages, they concentrate particles. They cause what they call corona ions because of the high voltages, and these attract particles, you know, so therefore it would have attracted the radioactive particles from the weapons test fallout, you see.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So there's the explanation. It's very neat, very neat. And not only is it neat, but it also explains the childhood leukemias near nuclear power stations, you see, because they also release particles.
Right.
If you go to the United Nations documents on the releases from all nuclear power stations in the world. I mean, in the UNSCEAR 2000, you can find tables that show the particle releases from every single nuclear power station in the world by year from 92 to 2000. And what you find is that they release loads of these particles, you see. So this is also an explanation of the childhood leukemia increases near nuclear sites. So I've nailed the whole thing. So anyway, this paper is coming out next week. So
that's pretty incredible. So the particles from the power lines actually attract the radioactivity from the nuclear power plants.
No. What it is that these are two separate things. First of all, we show that the high voltage power lines attract the weapons fallout particles. Okay, so when they blow up a weapon in the atmosphere, it produces lots and lots of particles, and they all rain down onto the ground, diddly, slowly. You see, over a long period of time. But they stopped the nuclear testing in 1963 because Kennedy signed an agreement with Khrushchev. They stopped nuclear testing. So from 1963 onwards, the rate of fallout decreased. You know, so like every 10 years you got less fallout because they weren't doing any more nuclear testing. But whatever fallout you did get was attracted by the power lines. Do you see?
Yeah.
So anyone living near the power lines would have been exposed to more fallout particles than the control groups who were living far away from the power lines. Yeah. So when you look at that effect, you can then immediately say that it's particles that are causing the childhood leukemia. Then after that, you think, well, if it's the particles causing the childhood leukemia, maybe that's also the case at the nuclear sites. And then you go along and you find out that the nuclear sites, the nuclear power stations, also release loads of particles. And so anybody living near a nuclear site within, you know, a kilometre or so of a nuclear site is going to be inhaling these same particles at a higher concentration than people living far away from the nucleus. Okay? Right. So it's basically the same explanation in both cases.
That radiation causes childhood cancer.
Yeah, that radiation particles cause childhood cancer.
Right.
Childhood cancer. That's something they've not figured out the mechanism for that, and so they say it doesn't happen. You see, so that what happens is that the various committees that consider these issues of childhood leukemia and nuclear power stations, they say, well, it can't possibly be the radiation because the doses are too low. But what they haven't considered is the particles, because the doses next to the particles are actually very high. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So if you inhale a particle that very close to the particle, the dose is enormous. Anyway, so that's the first story that I have to say. Okay, wow. So that's coming out next week.
That's going to be a big. Do you think that will have some reverberating aspects throughout the scientific community? You think you'll get a lot of pushback from that?
I have to say that they'll ignore it. The problem is nowadays with the scientific community is there's really no such thing. I mean, this was always kind of the case. You know, Thomas Kuhn wrote about the scientific community in 1962 in his famous book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And he talked about something called paradigms, in which he said the scientific community is like what you call normal science. So there are a whole load of scientists who sort of just believe in the status quo picture of a scientific idea, you know, of whatever question you're asking. And then what happens is somebody comes along and says, no, that isn't true because here's some evidence that it's wrong. And what they do, he pointed out, and he wrote this in his book in 62, he said that they ignore that information, okay? They ignore it. Hang on, what's happening here? So they ignore that information, and I'm inclined to think that they will try to ignore this paper, but it's getting much more difficult for them to ignore these papers that I'm producing, because actually I'm just going and visiting them now and going along in these committees, and I'll talk about this next, and making presentations to the risk agencies and saying, well, you cannot ignore this, because you know this is a real effect, and it shows
this is real science, that they can't just ignore real scientific studies.
You have to say that. But anyway, of course they will. I mean, and in the past they did. But it's getting much harder for them to do that now, because we're winning law cases, you know, on the basis of these evidences. Because if you go into court and you have a jury and you wave this evidence in front of them and you say, look, this is what people found and therefore their risk model must be wrong, then the jury will agree with you. They say yes, and so they lose the case. So I'm doing that too. I've got a couple of cases on it in America now. One of these cases is the Ronald Reagan USS TEPCO case. You know that one?
Yes, it's been quite mum. I've been trying to do some research, but I figure that they're in pretty heavy litigation because I haven't been able to find out much information on it.
Well,
from the news agencies.
It's going reasonably well. That they are. I'm one of the experts on the case, and the situation at the moment is that we have to provide evidence, but it's going ahead. I mean, they knocked it up to the appeal court, and the appeal court said, well, because what happened is that TEPCO and GE, who are they're the defendants, and there are lots and lots of plaintiffs, and the defendants argue that it should be heard in Japan. So then it got sent up to the appeal court, to the Ninth Circuit, to decide whether or not it should be heard in Japan, and they decided not. That it's going to be heard in California. So that's the latest thing, and so we're just now assembling all of the information, and we're going to be asking for disclosure of all sorts of evidence so that we can make a case. So that's
what do you think the trajectory is on that, on how long that will take to resolve? Like, how long would this case with the USS Reagan?
Once it starts, I mean, this is a big one because, I mean, there are an awful lot of, they're sort of like 500 to 800 plaintiffs, right, and more of them coming along all the time, you know. And so the way this normally works, and it hasn't been decided yet by the judge, you know, the best way of dealing with it, but the way it normally works is that that the defense and the prosecution agree on a number of test cases. So you because you can't actually it would take forever to look at absolutely every one. So what you do is you take a representative sample of the plaintiffs, you know, somebody with thyroid cancer, somebody with leukemia, somebody with some strange kind of upset that nobody can figure out, and you know, that sort of thing. and you then argue on the basis of each of those people whether or not, or what the likelihood or probability is of them having developed that condition as a result of their exposure to the radiation that came out of Fukushima.
I have to say, just as a layperson, it is stunningly dumbfounds me that they even have to fight their way in court about this. That this is, I mean, they were obviously gravely at risk with what they did, and it seems to be just kind of the status quo that the nuclear industry fights any type of claim that it's caused any kind of human health.
Well, that is certainly true. They do that, and they do it.
It's incredibly expensive. I mean, they make it. They drag it out in court for so long. I mean, they just make it incredibly. They add on. If they would just pay the money to help out the people that are the victims, I mean, it's almost as if they'd rather pay their attorneys than pay the victims.
No, I tell you, the problem is that if they actually concede that these people were injured by those sorts of exposures, then they're in deep trouble with regard to people who live near nuclear power stations and all the rest of that stuff, you know. So they'll have to shut the whole nuclear industry down. And then not only the nuclear industry, but of course the military use all sorts of radiation. They use depleted uranium weaponry, and they have all these missiles which they say, will win a nuclear war, but actually, in reality, what will happen if they had to concede that these low levels of radiation were as dangerous as all that, they would have to say that we can't have a nuclear war, because actually it would wipe everybody out, even if there was a limited nuclear war.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting, because in the last year since I spoke with you, I've interviewed a woman who grew up. Her name is Heidi Lambert. She grew up in Hanford. Her father was a scientist, I guess, worked on nuclear weapons, and it drove him insane when he started questioning things. They deemed him to be insane, and she had a whole different take. She didn't realize until she was like 40 that she was living, that was her hometown. She was living in a really toxic environment. Her point of view is that we had so much nuclear weapons testing in the 60s that it's almost pointless, like the whole world is basically contaminated. So your risk of getting sick it's not like exactly, where you're living. We're living on the West Coast, and a lot of people tell us we're getting bombarded by radiation from, Fukushima and our rates. But, life goes on. I mean, this is the interesting thing life seems to go on. People get sick, and it's almost like they're normalizing childhood cancer, normalizing being sick.
The woman is perfectly correct. I mean, what she's saying is what I've shown, in fact, and written about in lots of research papers, which is that the weapons fallout is the actual substantive cause of the cancer epidemic. And we all know about the cancer epidemic. I mean, in 1990 it was like 1 in 5, and then 2000 it was 1 in 3, and now and soon it's going to be 1 in 2 is going to get cancer. So the cancer rates shot up in the 1980s. They suddenly, they would be going along really flat, and then suddenly in the 1980s they started to go up, and they've gone up ever since. And the reason for that is that the people who were exposed, particularly those who were born in the period of the peak weapons fallout, that's 1959 to 1963, have a much higher risk of cancer because, of course, they got all that genetic damage.
Wow. 59 to 63.
That's the bad one, yeah.
That's
so if you were born then your risk of cancer is very much higher than if you were born in, let's say, 50 to 53.
Mm-hmm. Wow. That's very interesting. And what about, like, their children? Do they also have a higher risk of cancer?
Yes, they do. And that's another thing I've been working on. Is that last year there was a paper published in one of the big American journals where they pointed out that for colon cancer there was a remarkable and an anomalous increase in colon cancer in young people. So people aged 25 to 35. Now, it's been known, I mean, colon cancer is a standard cancer amongst the cancer epidemiologists and the cancer theoreticians for figuring out how cancer works. So that they've done lots of mathematical analyses of cancer rates in colon cancer, and they've shown that basically it goes up exponentially because it has to do with cell expansions. and that it really only cuts in after the age of 60. But what we're seeing now is we're seeing a sudden increase in the ages of 25 to 35. Now, if you look back at those, and I've done this, I've deconstructed that data, I've unpacked it, and those are the children who are the ones we're talking about. They're the children of the children who were born in 1959 to 63. So, you know, a woman's born in 1959 to 63. She takes a hit from genetic damage. Okay, so then she has a child in 1984. Right, that's, you know, because that's the approximate age difference when you start to have children, and those children then are 20 in 2014. You see, or whatever it is, 24. Wow. You know, anyway, you can add all the numbers up and do the distributions, and you find out that those are the children who are getting the high levels of cancer at a very early age.
Well, I have to say, I'm glad I was born in 55.
Yes, 55 is not so bad.
Not so bad.
It depends upon where you were born, you know, because it's not just the weapons fallout.
That's true. I was born in Los Angeles, where the first Santa Susana, that nuclear, you know, I was born in Hacienda Heights, actually.
Well, Santa Susana, I've done a lot of work. I won a couple of court cases on Santa Susana.
Wow.
But that mainly, the Santa Susana effect started after the 90s, when they started demolishing the plant and trucking all the stuff away and blowing up all the radioactive buildings and all that. That's when all that stuff got spread around, and that's what started it.
Wow. I have friends that lived, who grew up sort of in that neighborhood and never knew anything about it. Their parents have all, my one friend who lived maybe 15 miles from there as a child, born I think in 53, his parents both died from cancer. 2 of his sisters have died. They've all gotten systematically sick. So he suspects that it had something to do with that.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, it spread out. They trucked it all out to the Nevada test site, and they trucked it out along that road that goes east-west and north around that big empty dried out lake. I've done all the mapping and the plume dispersion modelling and all that. I've done a huge amount of work on Santa Susana. That was around about 2006, around about then. But I'm not allowed to. They don't want me to talk about it because they settled for a huge amount of money, and they don't. I'm not supposed to say anything about it, you know.
Okay, so let's move on. Let's don't talk about that. I don't want to get you into trouble. I really appreciate you sharing your time with us. We're about a half an hour into the interview. I know that you have some other things that you've been working on. Do you want to share any of that? Like, I think you said that you were talking to some people about the mud. Do you want to talk about the mud? Or do you have another thing you'd like to talk about first?
No, I'll just say a few words about Sweden.
Okay, great.
I was asked to go to Sweden to make a presentation to the Swedish Environmental Court about whether they should permit the construction of a nuclear waste repository in the north of Sweden, a place called Forsmark. I've been working on this issue of Forsmark since about 2006. The idea is to take high-level nuclear waste and to pack it into copper canisters, about 6 meters by 2 meters, and then plug it into the ground 500 meters underneath the Baltic Sea. Now, the Baltic Sea is already the most radioactive sea in the world because it takes all the releases from Chernobyl and the weapons fallout, and there's got no exit. So whatever you tip into the Baltic Sea remains there. So the idea of putting in, you know, millions of tons of nuclear waste in copper canisters, you know, the chances of them lasting are pretty remote. But anyway, they've worked all this stuff out, and they've written a load of environmental impact statements which are totally insane. And so a number of people have been attacking them, and I was asked to go along, and my particular thing was this risk model. I was saying that, you know, they've got the risk model wrong, so if any of this stuff leaks out, everybody's going to die. So I went there, and they were very good, the court. There were 8 judges, and they gave me an interpreter, and they gave me about an hour and a half to talk to them about all of this, and then the people who were going to do it then came back at me, and then I came back at them, and so on. So that all went ahead. Now, the story, though, the first thing about it is that the court has now decided that it's not going to make a decision. It's going to just make an advisory decision, you see. Actually, I think this is illegal. I think that the court has set up its remit as that it must make a decision. But anyway, it's decided not to. So we've got to have to try and get into the Swedish Justice Chancellery and tell them that they must order the court to make a decision. But that's not the story. The interesting story is that on the way back, the next day, I was due to talk to the British Energy Minister in London, Mr. Richard Harrington. He's the Minister of Energy. And so there was a big meeting set up at the Houses, just next to the Houses of Parliament, for me to go to. And I was like the main man, because I was representing the stakeholder NGOs. This was a stakeholder, dialogue that's going on. The government pretends to listen to the stakeholders, and the stakeholders tell them what their concerns are and so forth. So I was due to go back. Now the British government had bought me a ticket from Stockholm to London, and I was supposed to be on the next morning. So I went and sat on the plane, which is an SAS plane, to Heathrow, and I sat there, and they said, "Oh dear, the plane's engine has broken, so we can't fly you to London." Okay.
What?
Yeah. No, I know. Well, I sort of anticipated this. I sort of live in this kind of spy area, So anyway, what I did was I had already bought another ticket on a different flight, you see.
Because you anticipated something happening.
I know. Anyway, luckily I had, isn't it? But the problem was it was a bit late in the day to do this, because the other ticket was from a different terminal. So I was at Terminal 5 on Scandinavian Airlines, but the other ticket was EasyJet, and it was at Terminal 2, which is quite a trek. And the other thing was they let us off, when they kicked us off the plane that had the broken engine, they let us off in arrivals. So, you've then got to sort of line up with a whole load of people all waiting to show your passport. And then you've got to go out the passport bit and then come back in again at a different terminal. And I only had 20 minutes to do this, so it seemed impossible. But anyway, so I ran to the head of the queue, and I asked the copper at the passport copper. I said, how can I get to Terminal 2 quickly? He said, "Oh, you just run around the corner there and press a green button, and they'll bring a bus for you." So I thought, hey, wow. And he said, "By the way, that your EasyJet flight has been delayed by 40 minutes, you see." So I thought, this is the goddess for sure, So anyway, so I picked up my suitcase, huffing and puffing, and I ran like hell for where this green button was. And I pressed the green button, but as I was running towards the green button, there was some guy running after me in a suit, you see. And I thought, oh dear, this is like some dodgy character. So I turned around and said, "Look, what are you doing?" He said, he was an Englishman. He had shiny shoes, and a suit and no luggage. So obviously a spook. So anyway, I said, "Well, why are you following me?" And he said, No, I'm not following you, and so forth. Anyway, I pressed the wrong green button. I pressed the alarm button for the fire, you see. So there were all sorts of, the door opened and I rushed out onto the runway and so forth. And then immediately all these kind of armed policemen with black jackets and all rushed up with machine guns and so forth. So I had to explain that all away. And they asked him for his passport too, so he was looking sick. And so they put me and him in a truck, and they took us to Terminal 2 where my flight was, and so I got my flight back to London, and he ran away. As soon as he got to Terminal 2, he disappeared running. Huh. So I think that was an operation. I think that somehow they managed to stop that plane from flying because they didn't want me to go to this meeting. Anyway, so I go to the meeting. And what I find is that the minister now hasn't come to the meeting because he's suddenly been called away on business in the House of Commons. So,
wow.
Yeah, I think what they did, my interpretation is that they were absolutely desperate to stop me actually giving this evidence to the minister, and so in the end they succeeded, of course,
Wow.
But it does show you that they're running scared.
Yes, they are running scared, and to the extent that they're willing to manipulate things to keep the information from getting into the hands of people who might make a difference.
Well, okay. Well, the last thing then on the list of things is Cardiff and the mud.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the situation there is at Hinkley Point. The French are going to build a new power station, Hinkley Point C. The EDF, Electricité de France. And they've got permission to do that. But it now turns out that they have to dredge a lot of mud away in order to get all sorts of ships in to unload all their reactor pressure vessels and whatever. I'm not quite sure why, but whatever it is, they've got to dredge it. Now, the problem is that all that mud is radioactive because it's been sitting there for ages, and it's collected all the releases from the old power stations, as well as all of the weapons fallout from the nuclear testing, you see. And if you look at these mud cores, I've done it. So if you make a core of mud, so in fact I did this with Lorraine Murray, I did this in San Francisco. We took a mud core, and if you go down the mud core, you get a sort of historic level of radioactivity depending on the precipitation of the mud. You see, it's a sort of like an archive.
Yeah, yeah.
So anyway, fairly far down in the mud is the 1959 the famous 1959 to 63 weapons fallout, which I've been talking about in connection with the power lines and the cancer and everything else. You see, there's quite a lot of it, but it's at the moment it's safely stuck down about like 2 foot down at the bottom of the mud. But of course, if you come along with a dredger and you dig this mud up and you plonk it on a barge and you stir all the water up and everything, it just releases it all back into the environment. Do you see?
Right. It's going to mix it all up.
Yeah. So they've got planning permission to take this mud. Now, don't ask me why they're doing this, but the planning permission is to take this mud and go and drop it in Cardiff Bay, just off the town of Cardiff, which has got an enormous population.
How did they choose? When I read that story, how did they choose that location? Was there some logic to it?
No, there is some logic. The logic to it is that they have official dumping sites, which were set up long ago. So, you're allowed to dump here, but you're not allowed to dump there. So I think this is like an official marine dumping site. Wow. And what they say is, of course, because the radioactivity is so low, it doesn't really count as toxic at all. And we can dump it on the official dumping site. So that's what they want to do. And it seems that the Welsh Assembly government, because, Wales has a devolved government now, and not entirely devolved, but they're allowed to make certain decisions so long as, they don't upset the British. And they've allowed it to go ahead. So that's what the fight is about whether they should be allowed to dump this radioactive mud. And of course, the point is that just as I said, and this is why my paper next week is so important, because what that's saying is that the resuspension of particles from the sea is the cause of the childhood leukemia all along the Welsh coast and along the Sellafield coast. So like that big Sellafield leukemia cluster at sea scale is a consequence of particles resuspended from the Irish Sea up there, where they pump all this crap out into the sea from Sellafield, you see. So that's the cause of it there. And it'll be the same thing it'll be exactly the same thing in Cardiff. I mean, I did a study near Cardiff, a place called Chepstow, about 10, 15 years ago. I did a study of Chepstow, and I located a child leukemia cluster at Chepstow, just near the mud, you see. It's absolutely the same thing. So that's the battle that they've got in Wales that I'm vaguely involved in.
Wow. This is my question about all of this is the people that are involved in this, that are involved in, like, they have a financial stake in covering all this stuff up, they seem to have zero regard for life on the planet. Or, you know what I mean? It's just about it's just about making sure they don't get blamed for anything. And yet at the same time, they're really causing catastrophic harm to millions of people and throughout the planet. We have mass die-offs. I mean, and they seem quite content to mix it up with, well, it could be this causing the cancer, or it could be that. It's the whole, like the fact that you've been doing this for a very long time, improving all these definitive studies and working on it, methodically and diligently, and making an effort to get through to it. At what point do you think that it's going to shift? I mean, do you think that there's a chance that all of this, the whole, and I mean among the decision makers, that they're going to just say it's not worth it for us to continue to go along with the program?
I think it's hard to believe that they will ever do that, actually, because there's too much at stake. That's the problem for them. I mean, what there is at stake is, like I said earlier, there's the nuclear military aspect, the fact that they've got to have all the radioactive materials in order to make their missiles and bombs. And there's in America, for example, I think it's 600 billion or something is the annual defense budget. It's just unbelievably enormous,
Right, and they want to make it bigger.
A good proportion of that is tied up with nuclear. Now, of course, if they conceded this point about the risk model, they would have to sort of shut all that stuff down. On the other hand, if enough people make enough noises, you know, the other thing is, like, I was talking to this guy long ago when I started this, a Greenpeace chap, Colin Hines, and he said that you have to have corpses floating down rivers before they do anything. But actually, we have got corpses floating down rivers.
Right.
You know, in a way, that's exactly what we've got. The cancer rate has gone up to such an extent now that you could say that corpses are floating down rivers. So it's really, and the other thing is, of course, genetic damage. You know, the other big thing that I've been doing this year, and how my new method of targeting them is through the congenital malformations in the children. Now that of course, you know, affects everybody. There's a huge reduction in the birth rate because a lot of these children die in the womb or never get conceived because of the genetic damage. All this stuff was pointed out by Hermann Müller in 1950, but of course they ignored him, and everything he pointed out has come true. So the genetic makeup of life on Earth has been systematically eroded, you know, since 1945, since they started releasing this stuff to the environment. Now, the people who work for the nuclear industry, the scientists, these are the people you're talking about. You're saying, well, why don't they realize that they're destroying and so forth? I think actually they split into two types. They split into people who are too frightened to say anything because they'll lose their job and their status and their friends. And the other types who are just bastards, you know, who are just like people in the concentration camps, like Joseph Mengele, and they don't care. They say, well, you know, we are big, powerful people. We do what we like. It's for the greater good. We need nuclear weapons. We need nuclear power. People like Chris Busby are just nutcases, and we don't have to listen to him. I mean, this actually happened in this meeting in London. I can tell you. This happened in the meeting in London. The Committee on Medical Aspects in Radiation and Environment, they sent 3 people along to hear my talk. And at the end of it, the chair of the meeting said, well, are you going to take on board all of this research and respond to it? I mean, not even agree with it. Never mind that. No, not about agree with it, but are you going to respond to it? Are you going to say why it's wrong? Are you going to sort of, you know, discuss it at all? They said no. They said, we have no intention of discussing it at all. We're not going to do any more about it. Nobody's asked us to do that, and nobody important has asked us to do that, and we're not going to do it.
Just move along. You can come and squawk out what you want, and we're just going to ignore the information you provide us.
That's exactly what happened. That is exactly what happened. And this was at a stakeholder meeting where the stakeholders had nominated me to go along and say, here are the things we're concerned about. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Here are the research papers that show that this is all true. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What are you going to do about it? They say, nothing.
Move along. Rubber stamp, huh?
This is what Frank Zappa said, you know. He said eventually they'll, you know, when the evidence becomes too great, they just pull the curtains away and show you the brick wall.
Right. Exactly. That's exactly where we're at, isn't it? Right.
That's where we're at now. Yes.
I mean, the Fukushima sort of pulled away the curtains. Like everybody started. I, for one, many anti-nuke activists never really paid attention to it until Fukushima was so grave, you know what I mean? And none of the story made sense. And then a few months later, we found out there's meltdowns. And it's just been this long trickle. And all of a sudden, here we are almost, 7 years later going, this is really even bigger than Fukushima. It's been going on for such a super long time. They've just completely ignored it with no regard to life on our planet.
The interesting thing is they used to control the media. They do control the media, and they used to control the scientific media. Okay, so they had the journals. So, in other words, there were gatekeepers called referees on the journal. So if you write this stuff and you send it to one of the major journals like the Lancet or Nature or British Medical Journal or whatever, since about 2005, they don't even bother to look at it.
Wow.
But what's happened now is that a lot of Chinese journals have suddenly appeared on the internet. The internet has absolutely blown away the control of science that used to exist. So there are a lot of very good journals, that mostly Chinese journals, but some that are based in India or Iran or, you know, people who are not part of the Western hegemony, okay? They have they're very good scientific journals. They're really good scientific journals. And they have independent referees who are not in the bag. So the control of science that existed up until recently, and probably I'd say since up to last year, that control of science has gone out the window completely.
Why do you say just last year? Last year?
Well, last year, because I've been involved in this for this length of time, and there's been an exponential increase in these Chinese journals, which more or less began last year. I mean, there were a few of them the year before, and then last year there were a lot of them, and this year there are an enormous amount of them. It's sort of going up exponentially.
Why do you think it's the Chinese are putting these up? Why do you think that they're allowing it? Because that's a pretty controlled society. That
is a jolly good question, and I think possibly the answer to that is that it's a political thing. That if you like to think of it, the Chinese CIA, whatever they're called, or whoever it is that tries. You know how the American CIA try to control the media, and they control the news, and they control what people think, and they control the newspaper and all that sort of stuff. Well, if you're China or if you're Russia, you're going to think, well, how do we get the real message through to the people? Now, one of the most important messages on the planet has always been science. Science is another word, truth, So in other words, if you want to know the truth about something, you call it science, and you go and do research, and you do empirical research. So you don't just bullshit your face off. You go and look at something, and you say, if I add this, what happens? Oh, it goes green, right? And so this is what science is. It's based on evidence, You look at obviously if I were the Chinese CIA, I would say, look, the easiest way to deal with this is to find the guy who's attacking them and to give him a journal. And so what happened with me is that I get a letter from somebody in one of these journals saying, would you like to publish a paper, you see? That's how
Wow.
So I thought, yeah, okay. So I sent them a paper, and they said, oh, well, you'll have to pay us a load of money to pay. And I said, well, I've got no money. So they, oh, well, all right, we'll publish it anyway. So this is what happened. So I get quite a few very strange approaches from journals. I mean, one journal, and they're usually based in the United States, I have to say, in Texas or Delaware or various places, but they're usually Chinese, I think. It's quite hard to know exactly, but generally the people who write to you are people called Ping Pong or Chang Ching or something, Anyway, but they're very good. I have to say they're good, and they've got good referees. So they do send it to a referee, and the referee writes back and said, I don't understand this, and could you explain that? And I don't think you're right about the other. And, so that there is a sort of proper discourse there. It's not as if they just let it right through.
The process of how it normally goes through on a scientific journal.
Yes. Well, I mean, but the point is with the English journals, they don't even do that. I mean, I send something to the Lancet and they write back and they say, we're not even going to bother to send it to a referee.
Wow.
I know. I mean, I tell you what, about a year ago, when Yablokov was still alive, those people in Geneva, the independent WHO, they asked me what we should do about all of this stuff, because there was a paper in the Lancet written by all the nuclear industry people saying how great their theories were and how, radiation didn't hurt anybody and all this nonsense. I think it was the anniversary, it must have been 2015, it was the anniversary of Hiroshima. So there was this big Lancet production about how, as a result of Hiroshima, we kind of know all about radiation, and it's really...
I think I recall that, and the end result was... this study now proves nobody has to be hysterical because there's really no real harm. Yeah. We've had enough time that we've proven it's safe.
Yeah, so Yablokov and me, we wrote to the Lancet and we said, look, this is a load of bloody nonsense. And we want to be, and here are 3 or 4 papers that show it's nonsense. Okay, so you ought to allow us to have even a little letter just to point out that there are these papers that show that it's wrong, and that radiation is dangerous. Anyway, they wrote back and said no.
Wow.
Yeah,
just straight up no.
Yeah, just no. I mean, it's not going to go to a referee. They weren't going to consider it. That's it. They're not going to do anything. And
wow.
Outrageous. Science, on that level, science is dead. But the beauty of it is the internet now and the Chinese journals have enable us to go right around all of this gatekeeping.
So this paper that that's publishing next week really is going to have an impact. At least it will reverberate. I mean, that's a pretty big discovery, don't you think? That's how that interacts.
Yes, it is a big discovery. And the other big discovery I made was the one about the fracking. Remember that?
Yes,
that was a Chinese journal too. I got that fracking paper out, and it's now had thousands and thousands of hits. People are downloading it. It's now been cited by some guy from Harvard who's been writing about Pennsylvania fracking. So these things do get out. You don't have to go to the journals like Nature and the BMJ and all that. They're kind of getting left behind now. That nobody take any notice of them soon.
Well, that's the thing about they can deny all they want, but people are still dying, right? Like, that's the issue, is we're still having the effects, whether they want to admit the science that you've conducted is true or not. These effects are still going on.
Well, it's a battleground, and so long as I'm alive, I shall continue to fight.
Yeah, that's what Dave Parrish. Dave Parrish runs a website called Operation Save the Planet, and on YouTube he does these Fuku Friday. He does these 15-minute vignettes to get people to do their own research, to actually investigate it. Don't just Well, and what he said this last Friday was this is the bad news, folks. Radiation is going to be here for a long time. This isn't like a marathon where it lasts 23 hours. This is a long journey. All of us have to accept that this is a long journey. It's not going away.
I wish there were more people doing it like me, because actually it's not that difficult, I mean, there's one thing that could be done, which is a bit tedious, but someone ought to do it, is to look at the Japanese vital statistics data. Because when we looked at the Belarus vital statistics data, what we saw is after Chernobyl, there was a decrease in the birth rate and an increase in the death rate, and it was quite clear. Wow. So all you've got to do, someone who understands Japanese has got to go to the Japanese vital statistics data, and it's all up there on the internet, and they just have to plot the death rate and the birth rate since 2006, so you can see the changeover. I mean, that would be a very, very powerful piece of information. You stick that on the internet, those graphs on the internet, and you basically don't even have to go to a journal. People would all freak out immediately because you'd see the effect.
Right. The birth rate and the death rate compared.
Yeah, in Tokyo. That's what I wouldn't look in Fukushima, because you're going to have a problem in Fukushima because everybody ran away and came back and went and changed houses and this and that. So there's bound to be some alterations in Fukushima prefecture. But what I would do is I'd look in Tokyo, because a fair bit of that stuff came down and hit Tokyo, certainly to the extent that would have had an effect. So I would look at the birth rate and the death rate in Tokyo. And the other thing about Tokyo is you've got a lot of people there, 30 million.
Right.
So it's not, so you'd have a very high statistical significance when you saw that effect.
So, Dr. Busby, do you think that the effects of all of this radioactivity that we've had over the last 50 years, I mean, is it catastrophic to the point where it could actually really harm life on our planet? I mean, is this really like a death knell, or is this something you think that species can survive around? Like it doesn't cause that long term? I mean, I think this is where a lot of people are freaking out who just pay attention. And this is why a lot of people don't want to pay attention to it, because they have all these anxieties and fears that it's really basically a death watch.
I think it's not going to destroy life on Earth, but it's going to alter life on Earth. And what it's going to do is it's going to alter life on Earth very, very seriously. And I think it already has. So I don't think that we have to wait till the future for this. It's happened now. I mean, right. What we see now is an increase in the. There's a turnover in the lifespan. That's already happened in women, because women get many more cancers than men do from radiation. And there's a reduction, in my opinion, although it's quite hard to prove, there's a big reduction in fertility. So it's going to be a bit like that Handmaid's Tale, that Margaret Atwood thing, where people are going to find it more and more difficult to have babies, and then when they do have the babies won't live their lives won't be as long as they normally would. And we know from studies that have been done in Chernobyl on animals that levels, fairly low levels of radiation, cause quite significant changes in all sorts of things, that like the rate at which you grow up, and your IQ, your level of your ability to think, your ability to solve problems, all of those things are affected. We know that from studies. So the answer to your question is no, It's not going to wipe out life on Earth, but it's certainly going to have a profound and very harmful effect on life on Earth. Yes.
Wow, that's really stunning.
And I think it's too late now to do anything about it, frankly. I think that's it. You know, the harm has been done. And, I mean, it goes into all sorts of areas, you know. For example, tritium. We know from studies of tritium that it causes massive changes in the developmental stages of larvae of invertebrates. Now, these invertebrates are what the fish eat. Okay, so if you don't have it, and it's what the birds eat, so seabirds. So if you don't have the increase in the lugworms and the mussels and all those kind of things, because the radiation gets them, you know, right at the beginning when they're developing from their eggs, then they're not going to be any of these things for the birds and fish. Then they're going to be no birds and fish. Well, wowee, you know, you look out there are no birds and fish. Okay. Right. That in the Pacific, we now hear recently that netting programs have shown a catastrophic decline in salmon.
Right. Off the coast here, it was big news here off the coast in Oregon. 3 big trawling fish came back with like a handful of salmon, like nothing.
That's right. Well, so on that level, you see, it's going to cause.
Do you think it will regenerate itself after a period of time, or do you think it will just increase?
Well, if nobody did anything more, and they were very careful about overfishing and all the rest of it. In principle, I think it could regenerate itself, but it's not straightforward, you know, because if you reduce the stocks of some fish, then they're too far apart to mate. That's what happened to the Newfoundland cod. That's what happened to them. I mean, they can't regenerate because
they never meet up.
they never meet up. Yeah, exactly so. That's right.
No internet dating for the fish.
No, that's it. So, you know, there are sort of, like, Yablokov he was a population ecologist. That's what he did.
Wow.
And he said that once you get the population down to 11%, it's destroyed. That's it. You're finished.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yeah.
This is so stunning. You know what I just can't get over, though? You would think that the nuclear industry would just want to build a whole new industry on how to remediate the harm that's out there. Like, if they would just put technology and money into building up the scientific community to face this and to figure out a way to manage it and make it, just to remediate it and reverse the harm. Just stop the bleeding, stop producing it, and put real scientific money. It could turn into a big industry because there's so much harm out there, don't you think?
I agree with you, but I have to say that I have a very low opinion of the intelligence of these physicists. They sort of dumb themselves down by having a kind of mad belief in numbers, and they are hyper rationalists, so they can more or less prove anything, and they can exclude anything that they don't like the look of, and that's what they do. So when you actually meet these people on committees and you talk to them, you realize that they're really not very clever. That's the first thing, and they don't think holistically. So they're not thinking about the poor fish or you know, the children or cancer and all that. They're just thinking about the numbers relating to the specific thing that they've been asked to give the answer to. And in order to do that, they have to reduce everything, all the data, they have to reduce it down to the most simple level so that they can actually use mathematics, because mathematics can't be used on a complicated stuff. And then on the basis of that simple analysis, they say, oh, there's no problem. And that's it. You know, they're thick.
They are. I mean, I've run into a few of them here in Oregon. I actually argued with a young woman at the university who said that her professor told her that radiation doesn't harm anybody. Now they're studying. They're being told by their professors that anybody who thinks that radioactivity is harmful is just a conspiracy theorist and needs to they're not basing it on any truth. And I actually sent her to your Facebook page to look at you, and she said she would, but I don't know if she did. But they get trained from early on. I mean, this was a woman maybe 24 who was headed towards OSU to go study up there, and it is stunning how they.
The interesting thing is that they will never sit down and discuss this with me face to face. I mean, that bloke Monbiot who wrote all that stuff about me in the Guardian, he has been invited on many, many occasions to just sit down with me and talk it through, you know. So I'll say, what about this and what about that, you know, sort of discourse. They don't do that. They don't do that. And it's the same in Sweden. When I went there and I said all this stuff, nobody responded to any of the things I said. What they said is that I'm a nutcase. That's all. They don't actually take issue with specific items or evidence. They just attack the person.
Demean your character. That's their method.
Well, not my character, just me yeah, that's right. You know, everybody knows Chris Busby's a nutcase. He's the man who sells pills to the poor Japanese, mothers and all that nonsense that they came out with their attacks on me. And then of course, they don't have to deal with anything that I say, you see. That's the point.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Busby, I really want to thank you for making time for this interview and doing it on the fly and really just offering to just do it right away with me. I really appreciate it. I think your voice is really very helpful, and I am so grateful that you're doing your work and have been committed to this. I think it does make a difference and will make a difference in the future.
You're welcome, and it also gives me an opportunity to get this message out to some people. So that's also good, isn't it? Yeah?
Yes, it is. I really appreciate it. So, well, thank you very much, sir.
Okay.
And, this show will probably be airing in about probably next Monday. That's what I think. Maybe this Friday, but probably next Monday.
Okay.
So appreciate it. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care. Well, that was really a great little interview that we had, wasn't it, you guys? I want to thank Dr. Busby for that interview. I woke up this morning to check a message when I asked him if he would do the interview with me, and he said, "How about today?" So we jumped on. I pre-recorded this. We have about 3 minutes left, so I'm just going to add on some conversation about Dr. Busby's website and encourage you to go there. His website is called Chris Busby Exposed. It's chris.busby, busby.exposed. And on his website, he has a gallery, videos about Dr. Busby. You can really track and follow all the work that he's done. It really is up to us, you guys, to do our own homework, figure out exactly, how we can contribute. And actually, I think the most important thing is for us to really dig up the scientific information and make an effort to comprehend it ourselves. He has done a lot of the heavy lifting, and I have to say it's pretty awesome that he has agreed to continue in this work relentlessly, even though he gets ridiculed and demeaned. He is relentless in his pursuit of exposing the truth about the harm for radioactivity. So I encourage everyone to put your courage feet on, and that means take action even if you don't know what to do and you're not really sure where to go. Figure out what you can do for yourself, because it is going to require all of us. Like Dave Parrish said, this isn't a sprint, and this is not a marathon. This is longer than a marathon, folks. This is hundreds of thousands of years. It's up to us. We are going to be the ones that are going to change the mindset of most people, of the future generations, to let them know that we can pay attention to it and we can demand that solutions and answers be found. So thank you for joining us. We appreciate you listening to us. Please share our radio show and our station with your friends and family. Remind them that we're on the internet. You have to go to www.ucy.tv/AOF, 8 to 9 a.m. every morning. Thank you for joining us, and we will talk with you guys soon. Ciao. Care.